Hello and welcome to the Book Club of the Lotus Eaters. Today we're doing the late, great Sir Roger Scruton's book, Where We Are.
That's correct, we are. So I guess to begin with, who's Roger Scruton? Well, you probably know, but there may be people somewhere in Antarctica or something that don't know. Roger Scruton was Britain's premier conservative philosopher until his death from cancer in 2019. He was a professor of ethics at Birkbeck College, University of London, and he was a prolific author and wrote extensively about conservatism itself as a concept. One of the few conservative theorists we actually have to draw upon, which is nice. And he wrote this book in the wake of Brexit. This was a personal decision, personal response, and as he says in the prelude of the book, as to how Britain should cope with having left the European Union, given the current state of affairs and the current problems that we have. The book was published, I think it was published in 2019 as well, so it's pretty up to date. The problems are pretty much the same, and it's really, really informative, really enlightening, and I think that many of the ways that he's framing things are absolutely the right way to frame things. However, there are still some loose ends that we will find difficult to tie up with what we've been presented. And I suppose that conservative philosophers going forward should probably think about how those loose ends could be tied up. But hopefully we can explain how they are left on the table and what maybe we can even hint at what could be done about that. Who knows? But anyway, so in the prelude of the book, which is chapter 1, he explains that this is a response to Brexit, what we should do, and how the issue of national sovereignty can be conceived of in order to bring Remainers and Leavers together. Because I'm sure you're well aware there's still a vast divide between the two. I mean, the Remainers never got over it, obviously.
Yeah, particularly in the Labour Party, they're still hanging around. They're not openly talking for rejoining the EU, except on occasion, in which case they get roundly mocked because that's still not a debate to be had.
Yeah.
But
the Liberal Democrats recovered surprisingly swiftly, I thought.
We'll see what happens to them, I guess.
I suppose so. But anyway, so the main thesis of the book really seems to revolve around the crisis of identity that we have in this country, and I completely agree with him. And that the discussion that we need to have to move forward into a bright and positive future is being hampered by leftists crying, quote, racism and xenophobia at every attempt at discussion. So nothing controversial to talk about there. He says, we in the Anglosphere have a language with which to discuss nationality that is not tainted by bellicose slogans, warlike slogans. When we wish to summon the we of political identity, we refer to our country. That's very interesting because that's the place in which we live, and that's what Scruton is appealing to. He also has some really interesting thoughts about British identity that we'll get into a bit further on into this. But one thing in the prelude he points out, the specific thing about British identity that is not quite present in other European nations is the concept of accountability which runs through our lifestyle and institutions, our government, and is the origin of British reluctance to foreign rule. I think that's fair.
Can you tell me how those two are specifically aligned? Accountability and resistance to foreign rule.
Yeah, it's crystal clear. The further away the power centre from you, the more difficult it is for you to hold that power centre to account.
That's what he means by foreign distance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and not. Yeah, I mean that you could read it like that actually, but I'm sure it's a bit more prosaic in regular life. It's just like, don't want foreigners ruling over us. Totally fair. And all of English radical thought basically comes down to the idea of sovereignty anyway. And I think that's probably because we've got almost 1,000 years of unbroken political self-governance, and we govern large parts of the world. So it's kind of deeply baked into our psyche.
Probably the deepest being, the oldest probably being, presumably, with the Pope.
Yes. He in fact does frame the Protestant and breakaway of the English Church as a kind of proto-Brexit based on these moral sensibilities. You know, we shouldn't be ruled from Rome, so why are we? And things like this. But anyway, so in chapter 2, it's called Our Country, Right or Left. And so he takes his framing from George Orwell's passionate The Lion and the Unicorn essay. This was written during the Second World War, where Orwell was like, look, we have to be on the same team if we're going to defeat the Nazis and preserve what we have. And so Scruton lays down the way in which he thinks we should have a view of our love of country. He says, patriotism is based on respect and love for the form of life that we have. It does not depend on any grand narrative of triumph of the kind put about by fascists or communists, but grows from the habits of free association that we, the British, have been fortunate to inherit. think it's a wonderful way of delineating conservatism or traditionalism or patriotism from fascism and communism or national socialism or any other power-seeking ideology. Because you'll notice that these ideologies are always forward-looking. They're always saying, come the revolution, come the glorious new future. And Scruton points out accurately that the English, the British and particularly the English, don't do that. They look backwards. Look at the glorious past. Look at the wonderful things that we had. We need to preserve those. And it comes from the habits of free association that we've been fortunate to inherit, as he says, but we've also demanded them. We've demanded these habits of free association, and we should continue to demand them. And this is one of the reasons I just hate the lockdown so much. I just can't stand it. You don't get to tell me that. You don't get to decide that for me. I might decide it for myself. That it might be the right thing to do, but you don't get to tell me. But anyway, he puts the problem in our education system, one of the sources of the problems. He describes our current history education as broadly leftist because there are two narratives that modern schools, the schools can teach, and they've chosen one over the other. So he points out that prior to what I would say is my generation, sort of my parents' generation, the generation that the silent generation, things like that, they had what he describes as the proud islanders narrative. So the curriculum was positive and dwelt on our successes as a country. And now we have the modern curriculum, which speaks about liberation and resistance, as if we're being dominated. And so you've got many different interpretations. Actually, the Whig interpretation of history dwells on the Glorious Revolution, as you'd expect it to do, the classical liberal history, which I'm personally rather fond of ideologically. But the conservative interpretation, the Tory one, dwells on settlement and institutions, but both look backwards to explain how we are. Right, they're both like we figured something out good in the past, and we should preserve that. So the Whig and the Conservatives. That's how you basically find them in the same party now, because otherwise they just essentially be against each other, and they used to be against each other. Whereas the socialist rewriting of history, of course, looks forward, and this means any kind of leftism, communism, fascism, national socialism, they all go forward. And he says that it's completely normal that the British would look backwards because we have such an affection for our past, and I think he's right. In England, he says, the way of institution building was inseparable at every point from the attachment to the land and the desire to endow the land with the character of home. And you see this in the hedgerows that line the English countryside. There's no rhyme or reason to them because they were built up over centuries as a system of compromises between public and private property. And so this is why, like, the English countryside is a beautiful higgledy-piggledy mess of hedgerows and walkways among the fields and things like that. Wonderful stuff. There is also a major point on the way that the English conceive their own law. And again, it's the law of the land, not the law of the king or the law of the government. It's the law of the land under which we should all live. The sovereign himself is bound by obligation to uphold this law and even be subject to it. This is rare. I mean, most other countries, that just wasn't the case. The law came from the king. It was the king's law. And even you can go back really, really far in history to this. In 1220, he's got an example of a judge called Henry de Bracton, so a Norman name, who wrote in The Laws and Customs of England that the king lies below the law since it is the law that appoints him. So this is an ancient tradition, older than many countries are. We can't just abandon this.
A lot of people like to look at the English Civil War and then the subsequent trial of Charles as the first time or the real time that this is taking place.
Yep.
But it's much, much older than that.
It's much older. And
that's a 400 years before that.
Yeah, and it doubtless goes back into the pre-Norman conquest and the Anglo-Saxon times. You can look at Harold Godwinson's accession to the kingship. He wasn't a relative of Edward the Confessor. He was appointed by a selection of his peers. And so there would have been some kind of legal framework that he was operating under in order to be given that and be considered to be the rightful king. So, yeah, it's a very, very old tradition in England. And so, yeah, as you mentioned earlier, he identifies the break with the Church of England from Rome as a kind of proto-Brexit based on these same sensibilities, which I think is fair. And we also have the issue of identity crisis, because mass immigration and multiculturalism has, in his words, profoundly unsettled us. And I think that's a good way of putting it, because a lot of people know that something's wrong. You know, something is going wrong with this country, but they don't know exactly how to describe it or what it is. But it is unsettling. You know, the world is changing around us when it shouldn't be changing in these ways. You know, it should be changing in line with the existing and ancient principles of the country, not what appear to be foreign principles that are changing the very nature of what we have around us. That's wrong, in my opinion, and in Scruton's opinion. And so the question is, where do we salvage our identity from? Orwell, he thought, believed in the day-to-day habits of neighbourliness would be enough to salvage a shared identity, and Scruton agrees with this. The ideal of the neighbourhood as the source of political order. In his words, who we are is where we are. What do you reckon?
For Europe, this definitely works.
Why doesn't this work in England?
No, Europe is in...
Oh, right.
European continent, not just the Europeans.
Well, actually, I don't know if that's the case in France. In France, there seems to be a kind of ideological identity of what a Frenchman is, and they're very, very aggressive on the everyone who lives in France is a Frenchman. It's like, it's not true. You know, you can see that, and the Germans have got their new German identity, and the Swedes have got their new Swede identity. But you never hear anyone describe them as New English, which is good, because that's a horrific sounding phrase.
Germany's a bit of an exception to the rule.
Oh, I agree.
Because
but Sweden's following that example.
Yeah.
So
racked with guilt for something they didn't even do.
Yeah, very bizarre, isn't it? Anyway, so Scruton presents his theory of the British people. He says, the British people, like their Dutch and Scandinavian cousins, are joiners by nature. They relate more easily to clubs, regiments, schools, pubs and teams rather than to individual human beings. Or rather, they find human relations more natural and easier to conduct without embarrassment when they occur between people already joined by threads of membership. These are what Edmund Burke described as little platoons, as in the little like social clubs, you know, the local social clubs that people join. And this is essentially the origin of all of the good institutions in English life. They all begin this way. He says, we find the clubbable instinct, which prefers custom, formality, and ritualized membership to the hullabaloo of crowds. So you can see the total opposite of the French here. Like they fetishize the mob in Paris, as in this giant, the other people are uprising in the streets. It's like, you don't get that. You don't get that kind of view. You get the view that like certain discrete entities are doing things in England, and these are formed by voluntary membership. And so this, he says, it imposes a quiet and genial discipline in place of spontaneous social emotion. And I think that's completely correct. Like whenever you read about the French Revolution, it does spontaneous social emotion is the best way to describe it. And it's out of control. You know, there's no telling what the mob is about to do. But there is a much more predictable pattern to the sort of clubbable English life. And I think he's right on that. And the great thing about this the positive strength about this, also one of the core weaknesses of it, is it's hard to transcribe this kind of identity into a doctrine. You can't write a manifesto for this. This is something that just happens naturally. Any thoughts?
What, the clubbable nature of
the habits of self-association. You can't really make that out of theory, and so this is why it's just not theoretical in the same way that communism and fascism is. So much of continental thought doesn't understand this.
I mean, you could describe it and then adhere it to other people who don't have it, surely.
Yeah, you could, but I mean, I think it's going to be quite difficult to get that to become their instincts, because that's what he's talking about, like intuitions and instincts here. You know, you can't really reason someone into that. If they're not disposed that way, then they're not disposed that way. But yeah, Orwell described Englishness as a kind of bundle of sensations. He couldn't really put his finger on it, so he would just describe the sound of the horse hooves on the cobbles and the noise of the bus that goes by and the washerwoman singing out of a window and things like this. You know, these were all the sensations of England to him. But again, he couldn't give it an essential theory behind it, and I don't blame him. You know, it's one of those things that's almost impossible to pin down. For Orwell, Scruton says, his country was not a nation or a creed or a language or a home. Or a language, but a home. And so there's I can't remember who the poet was, but he wrote a little thing saying, you know, the Germans live in Germany, the Italians live in Italy, something like that. The French live in France, and the English live at home.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.